Hey everyone, welcome back to Drowsits. Never underestimate the power of a truly heartfelt, "I'm so sorry." That single line from the Reddit thread captures exactly what we're exploring tonight. Front desk staff often become unexpected anchors for people in their darkest moments, even though that's never written into their job description. What stands out most is how small gestures, like offering a toothbrush or simply listening, can make lasting imprints on someone carrying grief. It starts with a check-in that felt different from all the rest. She comes to the counter moving slow, like every step costs energy. You notice the exhaustion right away. I notice it. The slumped shoulders, the unfocused eyes, the weight that isn't just jet lag. It's heavier. She glances up just long enough to speak, then her gaze drifts again. Most people walk up asking for something. Top floor, away from the elevator, a view they can brag about later. But her request is different. Just a quiet room. Nothing more. No upgrades, no extras. That simple word carries a lot, and it makes me pause. What isn't obvious at first is the reason behind it. She's in town for her sister's funeral, and grief doesn't just live in your head. It wears down the body, too. It shows up physically. Red eyes, pale skin, an exhausted stillness where even lifting your hand feels hard. If you've ever seen somebody who's been crying for hours, you know that hollow look. That's what this moment looked like in real time. The front desk worker clocks every detail. The way her ID barely makes it to the counter. The uneven rhythm in her voice like she's forcing each word out. This isn't the kind of fatigue that recovers with a nap. This is the way someone looks when they've been holding themselves together across airports and taxis, and now they're just trying to make it through another minute without breaking. Travel always takes something out of you, but when you combine that with grief, the toll doubles. Missing items are common too. Basic things like toiletries or extra clothes slip the mind completely when your focus is splintered by loss. It's the kind of disorientation that makes small tasks feel impossible. Standing there, she isn't just another traveler. She's someone carrying a storm inside, working hard to mask it while in public. And every action, handing over ID, signing a paper, even forming a request, feels like labor. You don't need to be told why she asked for quiet instead of comfort or luxury. You can feel it. She wasn't simply booking a night. She was reaching for shelter. A place where silence might finally let her stop bracing against the weight she'd been dragging all day. And that's where her choice of words matters most. Why quiet was the only request she could make. Most requests at check-in are predictable. High floors, views of the city, away from the elevator. Little things people want to make a trip feel special. But when someone asks for a quiet room, there's usually more going on beneath the words than soundproofing or convenience. It's often less about noise and more about safety. A hotel isn't home, but for a night, it can function as a kind of shelter. 4 walls where nobody's watching, a door you can close on purpose. For people in pain, that privacy is everything. That's why in Reddit stories like this one, staff sometimes describe placing grieving guests as far down the hall as possible. Not for peace and quiet, but to give them space to break without interruption. I saw that dynamic in this moment. I didn't ask her why she needed it. I didn't push. I just knew. A quiet room means solitude. Means she can cry as hard as she needs to without worrying about footsteps outside the door. It's an ask that's less about the literal space and more about what it protects. That type of understanding doesn't come from a rule book. You don't learn it from a manual. You learn it by watching people. Watching the way their hands shake on the counter, or how their voices drag on certain words. After years at a front desk, you begin to recognize that a request like this isn't a preference. It's survival. So I placed her in a room at the very end of the hall. Fewer doors around her. Less chance of passing strangers. Yes, technically it would be quieter, but what it really offered was an escape from the world outside. A controlled little corner where she didn't have to worry about keeping a mask on for anyone else. And that's the heart of it, the coded request behind a soft-spoken phrase. A quiet room isn't about chasing silence. It's about creating a pocket of safety where someone can collapse without being judged. Because when you're carrying grief that heavy, the last thing you want is to perform it for strangers walking by. It was a small choice at the desk, almost invisible, but that kind of choice can mean everything to someone unraveling. The truth is, you never know exactly how much weight a person is holding when they finally walk away with their key card. And later, when the stillness of that space became too much, she reached back out. That's when the night carried her request into something darker. Later that night, the phone at the front desk rang. It was her. Her voice came through low and unsteady, like every word was pulled out between breaths she couldn't quite control. You could hear the breaking point inside it, the kind of sound that makes you stop moving because you know something heavy is coming. She explained, almost apologizing, that she had nothing with her. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, no change of clothes at all. In the rush to get on the plane after the call about her sister, she only grabbed her wallet and ID. That was it. The bare minimum to board. Nothing for the hours that would come after. That's what grief does. It pushes aside the ordinary. The brain sets survival on repeat. Get here, stand upright, make it to the next step. Packing logic vanishes. Later, when the silence finally lands, you realize the little pieces of routine are missing. The items that tether you to something familiar are gone. And suddenly you're adrift in a room with no anchor. She wasn't calling because of toiletries. She was calling because the absence of those small things opened the door to a much bigger absence. A sibling gone, a family reshaped, and now even the tiniest needs felt like evidence that her life had been rearranged without her consent. Threads online are full of front desk workers describing this exact call. Guests in mourning realizing they forgot pajamas, a charger, even medication, because their focus was locked on loss, not luggage. And each time, what seems like a simple request is just the surface of something unspoken. On the line that night, I could feel it. This wasn't a transaction or a complaint. It was the sound of a person collapsing under the quiet. The toothpaste and clothes were symbols. Proof that she hadn't been able to stay connected to the practical world. Hearing her voice give way like that, I could barely hold it together myself. What cut through most was how normal the request would sound in any other context. But here it marked the collision of grief and survival, where asking for soap or a shirt takes as much courage as stepping into a funeral home. Those items became markers of tomorrow, of life still waiting for her on the other side of the loss. And that's what set the stage for everything that followed, the forgotten essentials that revealed just how much grief had stripped away. Think about what happens when you're rushing to a trip you never wanted to take. You don't think about socks or deodorant. You grab your wallet, your phone, maybe a jacket, and you just go. The small things stop mattering in that moment. That's why she showed up without the basics, the little pieces that keep you feeling human. A toothbrush, toothpaste, soap. Things you don't even think about until they're missing, and then suddenly their absence feels enormous. Front desk workers online talk about this pattern constantly. Guests arriving for funerals, hospital visits, or unexpected emergencies often walk in without essentials. It's not just toiletries. They might leave behind clothes, phone chargers, or even medication, and it's rarely because they don't care. It often looks like triage. Your mind sets priorities for what matters in the moment, and holding on to survival takes the front seat. Everything else falls away. Her own list wasn't long. She needed a toothbrush, toothpaste, some soap, the kind of things most of us could grab at any gas station without thinking twice. But for her, alone in that quiet room after hours of holding back the flood, even asking for those items felt almost impossible. Grief turns tiny errands into mountains. And in stories from hotel staff, you see the same scene play out. One employee wrote about raiding the supply closet and pulling together toiletries, snacks, even a drink or two for a guest who'd arrived after a death in the family. The person broke down, not because the basket fixed anything big, but because it proved someone noticed. Someone cared enough to make a small gesture that said, "You're not invisible here." The details matter because they symbolize more than hygiene. Brushing your teeth means you're showing up for tomorrow. Washing your face means you haven't let go of yourself completely. Forgetting to do those things isn't just messy. It's a sign your world has slammed to a halt and you're still catching up. And that's the part that stings the most. You don't just lose objects in a rush like this. You lose the rhythm of a normal day. Meals skipped, clothes repeated, water forgotten. The easy rituals that anchor you start to unravel. Those small items aren't luxuries, they're lifelines. Tiny anchors when the world tilts. And when someone reaches out for them, the real question becomes, how do you respond? The front desk response is where everything shifts. The worker couldn't take away her loss, and he knew that. But he could bring her something real, something simple, and give it with the kind of care that actually lands. He went to the back and gathered what he could. Basic toiletries, still sealed items from the lost and found stash that most hotels keep on hand. Nothing fancy, just the things she didn't have the energy to go find herself. A toothbrush, toothpaste, a bar of soap. The part that mattered wasn't what he carried. It was how he carried it. He walked to her room, knocked softly, and stood back. No chatter, no loud knock, no attempt to step inside. When she opened the door, he just offered the items and, in a steady voice, said 4 words. "I'm so sorry." That phrase on its own can feel heavier than a dozen cliches. It doesn't explain or reframe her pain. It doesn't push religion or reasons she didn't ask for. It just says, "I hear you, I see you," and then it leaves space for her grief to keep breathing. For delivery, this is one of those lines you let sit, slow, unbroken, almost like leaving silence after music. He kept a little distance, arms extended just enough to hand things over, then pulled back. No attempt at comforting touches or over-explaining. And that space was its own kind of gift. Reddit stories echo this again and again. People remember not just kind words, but the restraint. The fact that staff didn't hover in the doorway or linger too long. Respectful distance becomes part of the comfort itself. He didn't try to solve her sadness because he couldn't. He didn't hand her advice. He didn't tell her time would heal. He made the exchange quiet and brief, giving her exactly what she asked for, and then making it easy to close the door. That was the help. Practical needs met, pain acknowledged, dignity preserved. A guest could break down on their own terms without being forced into conversation. That's why small acts work. They don't interrupt. They don't take over. They just steady the moment long enough for someone exhausted to catch their breath. Not everyone understands how to do that. Some people rush in with words that land wrong. Some try to fix what can't be fixed. But knowing when to step up and when to step back, that's the quiet skill you only learn when you've been put in these situations. And it leaves a question hanging in the air, because this isn't rare. Front desk staff run straight into this kind of grief more often than you'd think. What comes next is the hard part. Learning how to carry the weight that isn't yours but ends up in your hands anyway. Handling heavy emotional loads becomes part of the job, even when it's never written in the training manual. You're prepared for bookings, complaints, upgrades, but you're not handed a guide on what to say when someone's world has cracked apart at check-in. The stories online show just how wide that range can be. Guests arriving in shock after medical news, people showing up dazed from sudden losses, or whole families with nowhere left to go. One commenter described a family walking in straight from a house fire, the smell of smoke still on their clothes, eyes glazed over with exhaustion. That's the kind of moment where you realize the front desk is often the first real pause after disaster. What separates good staff from great ones is a kind of quiet radar for unspoken need. You start recognizing it in how a guest's hand hesitates or how their tone falters before they finish a sentence. The response isn't flashy, it's practical, delivered gently. Sometimes it's moving someone to the empty end of a hallway so they don't feel watched. Sometimes it's leaving a meal or some snacks at the door so they don't have to face a dining room full of strangers. 2 small moves, but they land hard when everything else feels unsteady. Just as important is knowing when to open the space for words and when not to. Some guests want to talk, sometimes for hours, and telling their story becomes its own relief. Others just need to close the door and not be asked anything else. The skill is in letting the guest set the pace. No pushing, no needling, just presence when it's called for and quiet when it isn't. And all of this, the noticing, the holding, the patience, it takes real energy. It's invisible work that doesn't get formally counted, but it drains like any other labor. One worker wrote about leaving a sympathy card and a few comfort items outside a grieving guest's door, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. That's emotional effort made tangible. The kind guests never forget, even if the worker never hears about it again. The truth is, nobody at the desk can undo what brought a guest there, but they can shave down the rough edges. They can keep dignity intact when the rest of life feels stripped away. The best ones balance empathy with action, give what's needed before it's asked, and see the person behind the paperwork. And stories like that don't just stay at hotel lobbies, they ripple outward. When this kind of moment gets shared online, the way people respond says a lot about how grief is recognized and understood. When that story first landed on Reddit, the thread didn't just get sympathy, it turned into a kind of shared classroom on loss. People weighed in not only as workers, but as travelers, siblings, parents, and friends who had carried grief themselves. What came through wasn't noise or cliches, it was clarity. Dogs and Cats World 1000 wrote, "Never underestimate the power of a truly heartfelt, 'I'm so sorry.'" That line sat at the very top of the comments with thousands of people agreeing. And it makes sense. No one in grief is looking for a lecture. They're looking for acknowledgement, a moment where their pain is seen and not explained away. Others chimed in with what not to say. And here's where the comments got really blunt. Lines like, "They're in a better place," or "Everything happens for a reason," came up again and again as examples of what hurt most. Even for those who might believe those words on some level, in that raw moment, they land cold. They sound like you're trying to wrap grief in pretty paper. Or worse, that you're telling someone their sadness is inconvenient. What people wanted to hear was simple, direct empathy. One person put it as, "Being heard is tremendously important." Another shared that even something like, "That sounds incredibly hard," has weight, because it doesn't tell the grieving person what to feel. It doesn't minimize. It simply keeps the door open for them to let out whatever's inside without being judged. And small gestures count too. Amanda Maelstrom reminded everyone that just leaving a sympathy card and a few comfort items can help. That advice sounds basic until you remember what it feels like to be emptied out and unable to ask for yourself. The act proves someone noticed, without asking for anything in return. When you read through enough of those replies, a pattern forms. The wisdom wasn't in complicated solutions, it was in restraint. No big speeches, no motivational quotes, just a willingness to stand next to someone at their lowest and not flinch away. That's what makes grief bearable in the presence of strangers. Being seen as a human being, not a problem to solve. Most people said a simple, sincere, "I'm so sorry," mattered more than anything else. And once this thread opened the door, other stories poured out too. Some of the hardest stories from hotel lobbies come from guests who arrive carrying tragedies too heavy to see at first glance. Front desk workers on Reddit talked about moments like these, the kind that stick with you long after the shift is over. One worker described a family stumbling in after their house burned down. They had nothing but the clothes handed to them by neighbors and first responders. Their pets were gone, their belongings were gone. They still smelled like smoke as they stood at the counter, dazed, trying to process that their home no longer existed. I remember that one. It feels impossible to picture until you've seen it. Another story was about a father checking in after his child's funeral. He said almost nothing, just asked for a room, paid in cash, and walked upstairs. The staff realized he never called for food, never came back down, never made a sound. The room stayed dark and quiet the entire stay. That stuck with me, because sometimes grief doesn't cry or rage. It just empties a person out until silence is all that's left. And there was a quieter but just as heavy moment. A couple who stayed off and on for months during cancer treatments in the city. They always asked for the same room if it was open, unpacked carefully, then disappeared into appointments and waiting rooms. Staff started to recognize them and see the toll each visit took, even as the couple stayed polite and never complained. Small talk at the desk became its own way of saying, "We see you here." These aren't rare one-offs. They happen often enough that front desk workers learn to notice the signals, even if a guest never explains the full story. You might never hear the whole background, but you can feel it in how they pause before handing over ID, or how their voice falters mid-sentence. Crisis doesn't walk in labeled. It looks like anyone else checking in late until you catch the undertone. And while staff can't fix any of it, they find ways to soften the edges. Waiving a fee, upgrading a room without being asked, dropping off a snack or a blanket. The smallest decisions add up to one steady truth. Kindness doesn't erase grief, but it can hold it for a moment and make the night more bearable. Those gestures connect back to something even simpler. The way words themselves can hold space when everything else feels broken. When someone is deep in grief, every word lands with extra weight. That's why the power of simple acknowledgement matters more than anything else. You can't talk someone out of the pain or patch it up with explanations, but you can be present for it. The default reaction a lot of us have is to reach for explanations, to try and smooth the edges. You hear lines like, "Time will heal," or "It was meant to be." The intent is kindness, but to the person receiving it, those phrases often feel flat, like you're skipping past how bad it actually is. Sometimes they even make the loneliness sharper, because they push the grieving person into silence instead of letting them be heard. That's why a simple, "I am so sorry," works. It doesn't aim to solve or tidy up the moment. It just plants you right next to the person where they actually are. It's not filler, it's recognition. A comment on Reddit summed it up perfectly. A heartfelt, "I'm so sorry," is 1000% better than, "They're in a better place now." That's the difference between affirmation and dismissal. One commenter mentioned that after losing their father, the only thing that really helped was hearing those 3 words. Not advice, not comparisons to anyone else's loss, just a clean acknowledgement that this was awful and it mattered. And that's backed up again and again. People want to be seen, not steered. Grand gestures like dropping off too much food or trying to organize someone's day can sometimes feel like more pressure. It asks the grieving person to react, to perform gratitude, when all they really want is stillness. Simple presence, a small gesture, or a short phrase lands better. Another Redditor put it plainly, being heard is tremendously important. From what I've read and heard, the most remembered thing is not the flowers or the meal, but the presence and the words. A knock at the door, an item offered quietly, or the calm of a sentence like, "That sounds incredibly hard." That's the kind of moment that doesn't need effort to repay. The hardest truth to sit with is that grief isn't a puzzle to solve. It's something people move through at their own pace. Trying to drag them forward only adds more weight. Meeting them where they stand, without fixes, without timelines, brings the relief of not being alone in it. That's why the phrase, "I'm sorry," continues to resonate so strongly. It doesn't demand, it doesn't reframe, it simply acknowledges reality. And it doesn't have to be more than that. Sometimes, though, words aren't the only way acknowledgement takes shape. Some gestures leave a mark because they exist in the physical world. That's where handwritten cards come in. In a time when most communication is digital, emails, texts, automated check-in messages, a note written by hand stands out instantly. It feels deliberate, human, something you can hold. It might look small at first, a few words on hotel stationery, no different from a reminder slip. But the act of writing by hand adds weight all on its own. Each letter takes a moment to craft. Each thought has to slow down long enough to make it to the page. You can't copy and paste it. You can't autofill it. That effort, however tiny, changes how it feels when you're on the receiving end. Plenty of guests have said the same thing. A handwritten note just feels more personal than any programmed response. You know someone actually paused, picked up a pen, and used their own time for you. One hotel worker explained on Reddit that their team keeps sympathy cards stocked at the desk. When a grieving guest checks in, staff quietly write a few heartfelt lines and slide the envelope under the door later that evening. No long letter, just a short acknowledgement. And here's the part that matters. Guests remember it. Not weeks later, but sometimes years. People wrote back in reviews mentioning the card. Some even said they'd tucked it away during their trip home and kept it for good. That tiny square of hotel stationery, tucked under a door, became the thing remembered more than the room itself. When grief leaves you isolated, physical objects become anchors. A toothbrush handed over at the right time, a key card pressed into your hand, or a folded piece of paper in simple handwriting. Unlike an email, it doesn't vanish when the screen goes dark. It sits on the nightstand, a quiet reminder that someone saw you when you felt invisible. That's where the lasting impact shows. These notes don't try to heal or distract. They stand still alongside a person's pain. Call it proof of care in a moment that usually feels hollow. The words themselves may be simple, often just, "I'm sorry for your loss." But framed by the act of slowing down, they become permanent in memory. In a digital world, a piece of paper can feel like a real hand reaching out. And what's surprising is how those moments stay alive, long after the paper has yellowed or been put away in a drawer. Kindness doesn't just land in the moment. It leaves a trail that people carry with them for years. That's what makes these stories so powerful. The smallest gestures at the front desk are sometimes remembered for decades, long after the trip itself fades. When you live through trauma, moments are etched in a way ordinary days aren't, and kindness becomes part of that memory. The mind ties that warmth to the chaos of the crisis, so when the pain gets recalled, so does the gesture that steadied it. It might have been no more than a toothbrush in a bag, a folded note, or a soft word at the door, but it marks the dark moment with proof that someone cared. One person in the thread captured it clearly. "She will remember your kindness her entire life." That's how it works in practice. People don't forget the worker who set them up in a quiet room when they barely had the strength to ask. They don't forget the one who knocked gently with toiletries and said, "I'm sorry." Those details return years later, almost untouched. Front desk workers sometimes find out about the impact long after the night itself has passed. A guest will post a review about their stay, calling out a single interaction that carried them through a time of loss. And what stands out isn't the amenities or the comfort of the bed, it's the kindness. People wrote reviews naming the staff, not the mattress, because that kindness stuck with them. On Reddit, some even shared stories of hearing back directly, years later. A guest might reach out to say that what looked like a routine act turned out to be the only moment of comfort during a catastrophe. For staff who hear it, that kind of note hits just as deeply. Knowing you made a difference, even in a passing way, makes the quiet choices feel worthwhile. These memories become touchstones. They shift how grief is remembered. Yes, the pain is still there, but so are the small signs that humanity cut through for a moment. They're reminders that people can notice, can slow down, can show care when it matters most. And maybe that's the real point here. Even a simple act, one sentence, one gesture, can echo through someone's life far longer than you'd think. So don't underestimate how much the little things matter, because often those little things become the front lines of humanity itself. This story reminded me that front desks quietly do this kind of care all the time. Staff might not wear the title of counselor, but in those quiet exchanges, they often become one of the first safe stops in a person's hardest days. And the takeaway isn't just about hotels. It's about how any of us can show up, noticing when someone is struggling, resisting the urge to over-explain, and offering presence instead of platitudes. A small kindness in the middle of loss isn't forgotten. It becomes the part that stays. This story is over. If this helped you unwind tonight, subscribe for more calm story time paired with cozy game worlds.